So today, my talk is called Lighten the Load. It's a path to forgiveness. I haven't talked about forgiveness in a while, and I think it's a particularly appropriate topic. In my view, it's one of the most challenging of our spiritual journeys, as anybody who's ever done any forgiveness work will tell you. The Greek word for forgiveness is asphasis, which means to liberate, to release from bondage. Author Jean Vanier writes, it means the remission of debt, guilt, and punishment. It is used when the prison door is opened and the prisoner can go free. When we forgive, we liberate. Now, the question is, who do we liberate? There are two ways to look at this image. I think the intended idea is that of the prisoner who is released. He's forgiven of his crime and he's absolved of guilt, walking free out of prison. However, when I first read it, for me, the image was switched. I asked myself, who is the prisoner and what is the prison? In my experience, the one who most often carries the burden of unforgiveness is the one who's carrying the resentment. Resentments do what? They close our hearts. They tighten us up. They sap our energy. I always remember the adage that resentment is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. I don't know about you, but the resentments in my life that I have difficulty forgiving do not add to my journey. In my experience, if it's you, if it's me, we need the liberation that only forgiving can bring. We forgive not for the other, but for ourselves. That doesn't make it any easier, but we have to keep in mind that the reason we are doing the forgiving is so that we can be lighter, so that we can be the true lights that we are meant to be. One of my references in preparing this talk was The Spirituality of Imperfection, Storytelling and the Search for Meaning by Ernest Kurtz and Catherine Ketchum. In it, they tell the story of a former inmate of a Nazi concentration camp. He was visiting a friend who had shared the ordeal with him. And he asked his friend, have you forgiven the Nazis? And the friend said, no, I could never forgive them. It was such a horrible experience. I will never forget them. I'm consumed with hatred. In that case, said his friend gently, they still have you in prison. We've all heard stories, and perhaps we tell stories of resentments and hurts we are not willing to let go. We all have these I have these favorite stories. She did X. Let me tell you the story of what she did. It was horrible. It was hurtful. It was terrible. No one has ever done anything like that. It hurt me so much. And let me tell you the 14 different ways it hurt me. So why do we do that? Well, I think we do it for many reasons. Perhaps because we think there are some hurts that we just can't get past. Haven't you said that to yourself? I'll forgive a lot of things, but not this. Okay, this is something that nobody could ever be expected to forgive. The wrong was so egregious that to forgive the wrongdoer would, in our minds, somehow minimize the hurt. This is a really important hurt. I can't forgive him for this because this was such a horrible, important hurt. We can't let her or him off the hook. There are so many reasons. I've been there. I think all of us have been there. We all have people on our never forgive list. Hopefully it's a fairly short list. It can be a very long list. If you're like me, you have a vague feeling that somehow your spiritual journey is a bit stalled until you figure out how to close out that list, how to rip it up, and how to work past it, even if it's the last thing you want to do. Forgiveness work is truly the heavy lifting of our spiritual journey, but it's worth it. Resentment is way too heavy a burden to bear, especially over the long haul. Dr. Kurtz writes that resentment is the poison of the spiritual life. That's heavy stuff. Resentment is the poison of the spiritual life. When we continue to resent, we cling to the past, feeling again and again the hurt to which we cling. The image he uses is scraping the scab off a wound. That's gross, I know. Not letting any healing take place. It's just starting to get better. Off it comes. Okay, it's still going to fester. It's still going to get infected, perhaps. Does this mean we shouldn't be angry at injuries directed at us? No, that is human nature. We all get angry. That's an immediate response. However, anger is an instant reaction. It's a human emotion we all experience in response to an insult or an injury. It's not the same as resentment. Think about that for a second. Anger not being the same as resentment. We are all familiar with the life and the work of Archbishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa, who worked against apartheid for so many years in a country and ultimately chaired the Truth and Reconciliation Commission upon the end of apartheid in the mid-90s. I've talked about that before. In his work, The Book of Forgiving, which is a fabulous book, and I highly recommend it, Archbishop Tutu describes the angry reaction he personally had, when a hotel bellhop in D.C., Washington, D.C., mistook him for someone's driver instead of a guest waiting for a ride. This is what he wrote. Were I white and dressed the same way, would he have posed the same question? My dignity was certainly assaulted. I wanted to strike back, haul this insolent boy to his manager and take him down the peg or two he had taken me down. But he made a different choice. He chose forgiveness. He realized that the error was one that was made from ignorance, and we are all subject to that. At one time, all of us are affronted. At one time, it is all of us that are doing the hurt. I've done it. I've probably done it in the last 3 days. At one point, it is all of us that is doing the hurt. We are all imperfect. He understood that we all need to forgive and we all need to be forgiven. See, this is part of our walk to compassion. When we open our hearts to compassion for all people, we realize that not only are we imperfect, but we realize that everybody is imperfect, and we're really all connected in our humanity and in our imperfection. It's heavy lifting. We don't like to feel that. It's so much more fun to judge and point and whisper. But that's not the way we achieve the true knowledge that we are all connected. Archbishop Tutu, when he made that choice, he chose a path that kept him in relationship with this other human being. Taking him and hauling him to his manager and getting him in trouble would have taken him out of relationship. It would have widened the separation between the two. And it is in relationship, he believes, and I believe, where we find our humanity. Even though it's sometimes so much more fun to find judgment and anger, that's not where our humanity lies. Anger would have also permitted him to ignore the real source of his pain. He was hurt. He had to take a look at that. Once he got past the anger, he could see that he was hurt. He wrote, I wanted to push away my sense of affront. I didn't want to admit to the sad, vulnerable place where that hurt had landed. We just don't want to see that in ourselves. It's so much more fun and so much easier to just be pissed off and not face the emotions in ourselves. Continued anger, growing into fixed resentment, enables this self as victim mentality to continue without moving through the hurt that is at its core. We remain stuck. We remain fixated on the hurt and the person who inflicted it. We are not free. He wrote, without forgiveness, we remain tethered to the person who harmed us. We are bound with chains of bitterness, tied together, trapped. Until we can forgive the person who harmed us, that person will hold the keys to our happiness. Think about that for a second. That is powerful stuff we are giving away. When I think about my own failures to forgive and my belief that some offenses that are just beyond the pale, that would be defined as most of the ones done to me, they're really horrible and really bad. I think of Archbishop Tutu and the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. If you get a chance to read about it, please do. His book, The Book of Forgiving, is fabulous. It's a wonderful book. As a matter of fact, our book group is looking for another book. We should take a look, just a thought. That body heard thousands of stories of violence and brutality and pain that were just absolutely beyond the pale, told by the survivors and heard by the perpetrators. That's what they did. They got the survivors in, they got the perpetrators in, and they had the survivors tell them, this is how I felt. This is what you did to me. This is the result of the pain that you inflicted in an effort to heal the wounds created by that evil system. If we can avoid the trap of resentment, however long it takes, we can progress from anger to sadness. If we choose relationship over isolation, shared sadness ultimately heals and we can move on. Resentment blocks this progression. Resentment just stops us. It keeps us locked in the endless loop of self-victimhood and focus on a painful past. Instead of a willingness to heal, we have a commitment to continued corrosive pain. I've seen this. I've seen it in life. I've seen it in my other life as a lawyer where I do litigation. People hold on to these things. People who have been grievously injured, but they don't have any journey to let it go and heal from what happened. The path through this pain and the path to healing is the path of forgiveness. Without forgiveness, we remain in this prison of pain and resentment. We never move out of our story. Our stories are important. Our stories define who we are, how we live, and how we relate to each other. We never move out of our story of resentment. We never rewrite it to one of survival and transcendence. It is our story to write. It is your story to write, not the person who harmed you. You get to write how you move through this story. So how do we get there? So in years past, I have heard of people talking of forgiveness work. Forgiveness work. I never knew what that meant. I know what work is. I know you get up, you go to work, you do this, but I never knew what forgiveness work was. I never understood what they were talking about. It sounded like a result we achieved through an act of will, just through an act of trying really hard, through effort. I have come to believe that it is not a journey of effort. It is not a journey of the mind. It is a journey of the heart. We must be willing and be open, but effort is not the answer. We cannot think our way into forgiving. Even though we can say, I forgive you, cognitive effort alone does not do the job. We don't forgive by thinking ourselves into it or by telling ourselves if we were really nice people, we would forgive, or by going up and saying, I forgive you. We don't even get there, I think, by telling ourselves that there's a lesson in here somewhere and this tragedy was sent for our greater good. That's always a tough one. I know there's a pony in here somewhere. I can't find it. But it was sent for our greater good. Instead, we forgive when we live from the truth that we are all imperfect and we are all connected. At one point, we might be the ones injured. At the next, we are the ones inflicting the injury. Living from this truth gives rise to compassion, empathy, and humility, which is the seed ground for forgiveness. It's opening your heart. This spiritual journey is just, in so many ways, practically in all ways, it's just opening your heart, when that is the hardest thing to do. Tutu wrote, I know that were I born a member of the white ruling class at that time in South Africa's past, I might easily have treated someone with the same dismissive disdain with which I was treated. I mean, think about that. That's amazing. That could have been me. If I had that person's background, that could have been me. He writes that his ability to forgive comes from the knowledge that he is capable of any of the acts that he heard about as he was sitting on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now, we would say this is Archbishop. He's not capable of all that stuff, but in his heart, he thought he was. He would have been able, given the circumstances that those people grew up in, that they lived in, he would have been able to perpetrate those same horrible acts. That's the same position that Debbie Ford took. If you've read her book, The Dark Side of the Light Chasers, another wonderful book, that's the same thing she said. She said, anything anybody did, I was capable of doing. And the way I open my heart is to know that. He wrote, there are two simple truths. There is nothing that cannot be forgiven, and there is no one undeserving of forgiveness. No one. When I hear that, a vast ground of challenge and opportunity rises up, because my first thought is, I can think of a few people who are not worthy of forgiveness, and I'll give you the list. We've all reserved people or events in our lives that are beyond forgiveness. I don't want to have to do that forgiveness work because there are some people that are just unforgivable, I tell myself. Archbishop Tutu, who has seen people commit and survive absolutely horrific things that I will never experience, that I hope to God you will never experience, challenges me and you to think otherwise. As I was thinking about this, I thought about the shooting in June of 2017 of the 9 African-American churchgoers by white supremacist Dylan Roof in Charleston, South Carolina. Remember that? And there have been so many horrific instances since, but I was focusing on that one. What did he do? He walked into a Bible study, they greeted him warmly, and he killed 9 of them in cold blood. We read in the news how the families of 5 of the victims came to his first hearing and said that they forgave him. Was it the result of instantaneous effort? I don't think so. I think it was the result of having lived lives of compassion, empathy, and forgiveness. I mean, your soul is like the garden. You prepare the ground to have these emotions, to have these awakenings through what arises in your life. I think the forgiveness those people extended was the result of having lived lives of compassion and forgiveness. The forgiveness shown that day was the result of an inner landscape that understood that revenge and resentment are not the way to peace and healing. Dr. Kurtz cited a Seattle University study on many people who had been grievously wronged and yet had forgiven. The study found that people who no longer carried resentment did not describe their forgiveness as due to any effort on their part, but something that happened when they just stopped trying and let go. Not effort, not thinking, just releasing. What they found was not a way to forgive, but an awakening to the truth that in their hearts, they had already forgiven. It's a spiritual process of inner transformation we do every day. It doesn't wait for that event. It's part of that daily practice. You know, I couldn't get through a talk without saying daily practice. It's part of that daily practice that cultivates that soul landscape that gives our hearts the capacity to be open and the capacity to forgive. Think of the Dalai Lama, who was so wronged by the Chinese as a teenager years ago. He refuses to hate them, instead looking to them as his greatest teacher. Our ability to forgive depends on our understanding that we have a choice when we are injured. We cannot control the injury, but we can decide whether we choose healing or whether we choose revenge and resentment and closing down. As Archbishop Tutu put it, every time we are injured, we stand at the same fork in the road and choose to travel either the path of forgiveness or the path of retaliation. Even in the midst of righteous anger or rage, even if we are blinded by grief and pain, even if our suffering feels so immense and so unfair, we always make a choice. Forgiveness is nothing less than how we bring peace to ourselves and our world. I've heard it described in Eastern traditions as a metta practice. Metta or Maitri means benevolence, loving kindness, friendliness, goodwill, amity, an active interest in the happiness of others. A loving kindness progression from ourselves to those we love, to those we know, to those we dislike, to all beings, helps us open our hearts to this compassionate forgiveness. Archbishop Tutu writes of a practice the Dalai Lama has. These two are great friends, by the way. He writes of a practice the Dalai Lama has, taking and receiving. He has a meditation that he calls giving and taking. He visualizes sending his enemies his positive emotions, such as happiness, affection, and love. And he visualizes receiving their negative emotions, what he calls their poisons, hatred and fear and cruelty. He takes care not to blame or judge their actions. He breathes in their poisons and he breathes out his compassion and forgiveness. This is how he reduces hatred and how he cultivates a forgiving mind. Think about that. How many opportunities do we have these days to do that? To breathe in the cruelty and the hate that so infects our environment and breathe out compassion. So we also have to consider what forgiveness is not. Dr. Kurtz and Archbishop Tutu, they both teach that forgiveness is not forgetting and it's not excusing. We are all responsible for our actions and we are accountable for them. What we do matters and we need to know that. When we are injured, we are not helped by forgetting what happens. How many people, when they're injured, I just got to get past it. I got to put it out of my mind and move on. I'm just going to power through. That's my favorite. I'm just going to power through this. Really? How is that working for you? You don't power through these things. Unfortunately, that is not the way it works. We journey through these insults, these injuries, these cruelties, in a sense, by integrating them into our story and realizing that they have changed our story. We are different now, and truth requires that we know that. We integrate it. We forgive it. We let it go. But having said that, we still know that it happened, and we do not run from that fact. We take as long as it takes. There is no timeline. We just develop some tools to think about it, to sit with it, to help us achieve release and peace. We are invited to be willing to take that first step. We can't see all the steps, but if we just take the first step and the next step, maybe that's what forgiveness work is. We just take the first step and the next step that calls to us on this path. When I look at my own spiritual journey and contemplate the work to do, I realize for me that forgiveness so often lies at the center. Forgiving others as well as forgiving myself. That's also a tough one. Forgiving yourself. We're so tough on ourselves. Asking forgiveness for wrongs I have done. It is not an easy walk, but it is a necessary walk. So as you leave here, as you go through the next few days, the next week, look at the people around you, the people at whom you take offense. Ask yourself, consider if you can make a choice away from retaliation toward reconciliation, toward relationship and connection. If you can, reflect on how that changes the energy for you. Reflect on the feelings that result. All we need is willingness to begin and knowing that at the end, we will find peace. So thank you.